into that, if I've not met you, my name's Abby Holovach. I'm from Fort Worth, Texas, so I'm super excited to be able to present for you guys. I really appreciate the invitation. I have my own business, Vibe Environmental, doing all sorts of things under the EHS realm. So everything from environmental stuff like stormwater plans, spill plans. Okay, now he's really close. This person must be right out front of my house. So again, anything under the sun. HAZWOPER training, so getting into HAZWOPER today, RCRA, DOT hazmat, plus, all the inspections, program creations, all the fun stuff. So definitely satisfies my itch for variety, we'll put it that way. I also do a lot of trainings for UTA, so that's the University of Texas at Arlington. So that's a local university we have here in their Environmental Training Institute. So folks who are trying to earn certifications through there, I get to train them as well. So it's a lot of fun. Previously, I was environmental manager at Holtcat, so it was a Caterpillar distributor, manufacturer, so I saw a lot of variety there. My bulk of my experience in the health and safety world was at a spill response company, so CG Environmental. They're now owned by EnviroServe. A lot of the spill companies are pretty incestuous. They're all buying each other out. So there's a lot of intertwined webs there. But we'll kind of talk about contractors within this presentation. I also worked at a joint reserve base for about a year and a half. That was all I could take. It was definitely a joint reserve base, emphasis on reserve because there was nothing going on. but it was definitely interesting, though, to see the federal perspective. And then my first big girl job was with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, so as an environmental regulator. So I was going out doing waste investigations. So waste is like always kind of at my core. I love waste. So don't get me started talking about waste because I won't stop. And then, of course, I'm very much involved with an ASSP. So I am our current Region 3 RVP, so our regional vice president. So that's Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. So I'm supporting all of our chapter presidents. So it is a 3-year term, and I'm just coming into wrapping up the first year. So it's going by fast already. But those are just a few of my critters you can see on the screen. I've got a lot of cats. I've got a couple dogs. I've got a chinchilla, a rabbit, a Quaker parrot, a pigeon. I don't know if I mentioned my rabbit. And then, of course, you probably maybe have already heard him, or you'll hear him at some point. That is a chicken right there in that photo on the right. That is Harriet. We did not know that he was a male. We got him as a day-old chick 7 years ago. And then he started crowing, a few months in, and we were like, well, too late. So you may hear Harriet crowing. All right, so this is a fun topic that we're going to talk about today because I think everybody's going to walk away with probably something they didn't realize about HAZWOPER requirements, and in a good way, to where I think there's been a lot of overkill in areas where people just didn't really understand the regulations and we weren't using it right. So that's going to be a lot of what we talk about, is how the fact that this is one of the most misunderstood standards of who needs what level of HAZWOPER training. So that's what we're going to discuss is how do we figure that out? How do we know what level of HAZWOPER training our people need, that our teams need, and where do we draw that line? And how do we make it, defensible in terms of our programs and policies? And just putting this together, I learned some cool stuff. So hopefully everybody will walk away with some tidbits. All right, so I think a lot of us know usually the default is 40 hour. Most people will just be like, oh, they need HAZWOPER, just send them to 40 hour. Everybody's getting a 40 hour. Or they may go the opposite route where they say, oh, we don't have any hazmat, so we don't need any HAZWOPER training. Another common issue you might see is people treating all spills like emergencies. So they're going, taking it too far basically, which can actually cause other problems in itself. And then not really defining exactly what employees are really supposed to do during a release. And that's going to make all the difference like we talk about. So this creates risk, of course, because employees are trained for the wrong scenarios. I've done some HAZWOPER trainings where these people were never going to wear level A gear. But, the employer wanted them to do 40 hour. They wanted them, doing level B gear, level A, putting on the SCBA. So it was kind of just like a fun week, but they were never actually going to do that. So it was like the wrong focus. We want to focus on the things that they'll actually be doing versus the wrong scenario, not the right fit. So not being trained for what they're actually going to do. So overtraining, we waste time. It's low engagement. You know, you've got people sitting there for 5 days wondering what the hell they're doing here because it doesn't have anything to do with them. Or undertraining, so the opposite end of the spectrum. So improper responses, exposure risks, citations, because people don't really know what they're doing. Yeah, they may have a 40-hour certificate, but you know they've not practiced. That's not their actual role, and they're just kind of thrust into a situation they're not prepared for. So that's what the root of HAZWOPER is about: is getting our employees knowing what to do during a release, and not just worst case scenario. Where do they actually fit in? And then we can plan around that. So some of the stuff we'll talk about. So of course, background and purpose of HAZWOPER and how it's structured. We'll talk about, is a release incidental or is it an emergency? Because that's going to make the difference in terms of what HAZWOPER training they're supposed to have. And then distinguishing between the different types of HAZWOPER requirements. So whether it's emergency response at like an industrial facility, or a cleanup site like a Superfund site, or a treatment, storage, and disposal facility. So, you know, where your hazardous waste ends up. We'll look at how do we assign those correct training levels: awareness, operations, technician. And then we'll wrap up with some common mistakes and talk about how you can defend your training decisions. So if you ever do have a situation where someone's asking you why your people are trained at the level that they are, you've got the meat to back it up. So speaking of meat, this is a very meaty presentation. So if you do have questions, you know, drop them in the chat, and at the end we'll address them. And the only reason I say that is because there's just like a lot of content. And I tried to make it smaller, but it's just, you know, I didn't want to cut out anything important. And there's some really important elements that if you don't get one piece, you're not going to get the others. So just drop your comments in the chat or your questions. All right, so why does HAZWOPER exist to begin with? So this came about because we had a lot of these situations where they were completely out of control. And, you know, even back in the day, we realized this has got to stop. So things like Love Canal, Valley of the Drums, Times Beach, essentially these first Superfund sites. Because before there were these regulations, you know, folks were dumping hazardous waste, chemicals, they were storing them improperly. And then we had workers who were being exposed to that material, not to mention the people that were living in those areas. So due to that worker exposure, you know, really high profile environmental damage, they were really under the spotlight. That's where they started to see, all right, we've got to do something about this structured protection, this structured approach. So this actually started with the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act, or CERCLA. So this is better known as our Superfund law. So this was in 1980, where they said, okay, we've got these nasty sites. There's nobody around really to pay for it. You know, these are legacy sites. They've been there for a long time. The responsible party is long gone, but we need to get them cleaned up. So that's what CERCLA did, is they focused on that environmental liability and the cleanup process. Versus we had SARA, the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act. This was in 1986, where they started waving the red flag from the safety perspective. They're saying, all right, CERCLA says we're going to get these sites cleaned up, but SARA is saying, how are we going to protect the people who are cleaning up these sites to begin with? So that's this environmental regulation that led right into HAZWOPER regulations. And it basically told OSHA, we need for you to come up with your own regulations to protect these HAZWOPER workers at these Superfund sites or these uncontrolled contamination sites. So that's what the standard was built around: high risk, uncertain environments. And that key right there, we're going to come back to that, and why a lot of times 40-hour is overkill, because the 40-hour HAZWOPER is around high risk, uncertain, uncontrolled environments. And we'll talk more about that. So we've got three separate chunks to HAZWOPER. So first off, we've got regulations for our cleanup sites. So these are like our Superfund sites, where we've got specific triggers and specific training requirements described in the regulations. And that's what the E is for. So under the citation 29 CFR 1910-120, it's the regulation for HAZWOPER, we've got these subsections. So E is specific for cleanup Superfund sites. P is for TSDF operations. So a little bit different expectations and requirements here. This is for those treatment, storage, and disposal facility operations. Versus Q is for emergency response. And this is typically what comes into play at your facility, is Q in particular. So that's really kind of where I honed in on this training, and the focus of what we'll talk about is Q. Because a lot of times, like, EHS managers are looking at requirements under E. or P, and they're not actually focusing on the right subsection within HAZWOPER. So a lot of times we see them incorrectly blended together, and we're going to look at what are the different triggers and requirements for each. So the core intent of HAZWOPER, like we said, this applies to those uncontrolled releases. We've got unknown hazards. We've got high-risk environments. It's not intended for, and this is a big factor here, we want to make sure that we've, incorporated in our facilities and our procedures. HAZWOPER is not meant for routine operations, predictable hazards, incidental spills. So, we're not going to go to a full-blown 40-hour HAZWOPER for someone who's never going to be involved in an uncontrolled release or some type of, unknown hazardous materials situation. Maybe the only, part they'll ever play is cleaning up a few drips and dribbles. Well, they may not need a full-blown 40-hour HAZWOPER. They definitely probably don't, and we'll talk more about that. But we need to make that differentiation right off the bat, is that HAZWOPER is based on risk and response, not necessarily just the presence of the chemicals, but the degree to and the involvement that your employees are going to play in that cleanup, and the type of release it even is in the first place. Uncontrolled, true emergency, or just a routine, this is just part of the job, we have drips and dribbles and incidentals. So what does this mean for folks like us, who are in these EHS roles, and we're trying to figure out, what level of HAZWOPER do our people need? So the most important question we want to ask is, what do our employees actually do when something has spilled? Because based off of that, that's going to determine, all right, what level of HAZWOPER do they need, and does HAZWOPER even apply? What section applies? What training level is required? So if this question is unclear, or the answer to this question, I should say, is unclear, then your program's not going to be defensible. Because that's going to be the first thing. If a regulator did come in, let's say you had a catastrophic event, you had employees go out and respond to this spill, one of them gets hurt, and then now you're under, some type of OSHA investigation. And then they're going to come in and start asking about your HAZWOPER program and say, have you defined what your employees are actually required to do when there's a spill? So we always want to start there. All right, so under 1910-120, got a couple of things we're going to focus on here, really determining, does HAZWOPER even apply? So first off, HAZWOPER applies to those emergency response and cleanup scenarios. So hazardous materials, that releases that could pose that serious health or safety risk. Focuses on uncontrolled releases. So again, not routine, not these smaller manageable spills, the incidentals. And it does focus in on, like, if we have that immediately dangerous to life and health environment or atmosphere, so IDLH, there's some type of fire or explosive hazard, high toxicity, or we've got people evacuating. Now these types of situations are triggering, this is a HAZWOPER spill. So making this determination, we want to take it in 3 steps. So 1, is the release incidental or is it an emergency? So like we said, is this true HAZWOPER emergency, or is this just part of the job, day-to-day, small incidentals? 2, how are the employees are they expected to respond at all? Really, that's the first question. Or are they just going to make an emergency phone call? Or are they just going to press a button? Or are they going to start putting down boom, plugging, patching? Are they going to be expected to respond? And then question number 3, what actions are you actually expecting them to take? So not only is this helpful for your program development and determining what level of HAZWOPER they need, but you're also making it crystal clear for your employees. Here's what's considered an emergency. Here's what I'm expecting you to do. So that way there's no guessing here. But everything in HAZWOPER is going to flow from these 3 decisions. So touching back on hazards, incidentals versus emergency spills. So we've got, a lot of information on these slides, I know, but at least you'll be able to come back and reference this later. I am going to provide you with the links for the full presentation, so you'll have all this to look at. So what's covered when we talk about spills? So obviously it's going to be if you have hazardous substances on site that could potentially spill, which, if you're storing it, there's a spill potential. Or some type of release potential, then 10-to-1, you've potentially got a HAZWOPER situation. We'll talk about, though, even materials that aren't, DOT regulated or hazmat, like just hydraulic oil, it could still get into HAZWOPER territory. We'll talk about that. Of course, if you have hazardous waste, or if you're at some type of cleanup site, like we said, a TSDF.
Sorry, I'm in a meeting. What? Yeah. Just Thank you. Oh, that's like an awesome question.
Oh,
Thanks.
somebody's off
Yeah.
mute.
Yep.
Sorry, I was so confused. I thought someone was asking me a question. I'm like, what's that? And then, of course, things like biological agents, anything that's going to cause harm if it's released. So, like we said, pretty wide umbrella captured here in terms of HAZWOPER substances. And then again, we look at incidental versus emergency, because if it is an incidental, it's not going to be under HAZWOPER. So those small, controlled, low-risk spills, it could be handled immediately by trained employees who just have HAZCOM training, some basic spill kit training. But again, there's no significant threat to people, the environment. They're not having to put on special gear. Again, our incidentals. Versus emergencies, it's going to be beyond their capability or of control. Goes down the drain. Now we've got fumes, we've got vapors, unknown high haz. We've had to evacuate. We're calling in a hazmat spill team. All of those things are definitely going to be pushing you into HAZWOPER territory. So, incidental in a nutshell: small, limited hazard, can be handled safely by nearby employees, and uses normal procedures and gear. Versus emergencies: significant hazard or exposure risk, and we may have those vapors, fire, explosion hazards. It's going down the drain, so environmental impact. And we're calling a hazmat crew out now because it's gotten that bad. So again, not all spills are emergencies. Classification is going to depend on the risk. So this is something you'd want to have clearly defined within your policy or program at your facility. So what does it mean beyond their control? Just a few more definitions here. So again, high concentrations of toxic substances. We've got monitors going off. We've got alarms going off. Oxygen deficiency, those IDLH environments. Now we've had to, evacuate. There's that immediate threat to life, health, or safety. We're calling 911. Can't be controlled with the available spill kits. Again, it exceeds their capabilities. Or it's just completely uncontrolled. We don't know what it is, or we know what it is, but it's going to need some specialized response. And again, maybe we're having to call a contractor or an outside responder. So, again, just want to make that differentiation: incidental versus a true emergency under HAZWOPER. So, OSHA may look at your program and ask questions like this, okay? Have you thought about the factors of toxicity and volatility with the materials that may potentially spill at your site? What about, have you defined quantities released? What really is an incidental versus emergency? Have those black and white terms within the program. What about exposure potential related to those materials spilled? Considering locations, indoors, where vapors may accumulate, like in a confined space much more quickly, or in a drain. Employee capability and training, and then available gear that's actually on site. So one spill at one facility could be considered an incidental. It's not a big deal to them, versus another facility where it is a true emergency. They're not trained for it. They don't have the gear for it. So again, we have to look contextually as well. So giving you some visuals here. So let's say we have a small oil spill in a shop. That would just be incidental. It's just a little spill. They can use their spill kit. They're not having to put on special gear. There's no special hazards. Versus the same spill that's now approaching and then gets into a storm drain. Now we've approached emergency territory because now we're affecting the waterway. So now we've got this environmental risk. Or let's say there's a solvent that's been spilled. Maybe it's only a little bit, but it's in a confined space, and that space doesn't have adequate ventilation. Now we've got vapor hazards, and that would be an emergency. So again, look at the context. That's going to help drive classification of the event. Not just the size, of course, that's also important to define, but the context as well, specific to your operations. So it brings up a good question that I hear a lot, like oil spills. So let's say you have hydraulic oil. Some oils can be hazardous substances under OSHA, depending on their safety data sheet and what's going on there. But a lot of these spills may not be considered HAZWOPER emergencies because we're less likely to have those IDLH environments or, situations where they're vapor hazards. So it may be an incidental spill, so small controlled leaks. We can clean it up immediately, use our spill kits, and it's covered under our normal workplace procedures. So it may not be an emergency response. But let's say you've got a tank of hydraulic oil or used oil, and it's 5,000 gallons. Well, the worst happens. Now the whole thing is broken and draining. Now we've got a massive spill. Now this could become a HAZWOPER emergency. We may need to evacuate. It's beyond your employees' capabilities to safely manage and clean up. And now it's potentially getting into a storm drain or a waterway. This would be an emergency response. So this is a great example of, where we see the line drawn in the sand of where, smaller oil spill may not be real hazmat in a lot of cases, may not be an emergency, but with large enough quantities, it can be. So again, just something else for us to consider. So this component in a nutshell: small controlled spill, incidental, not necessarily HAZWOPER. They can clean it up safely. There's not a lot of hazards involved. Again, very small incidentals, not HAZWOPER. Versus dangerous escalating spill. It's an emergency. A lot of these triggers that we talked about, we're having to call first responders. People are evacuating. HAZWOPER is going to apply. Next question we want to ask ourselves is, if employees are responding, what exactly are they doing in that response? So if we've determined, yes, we have a HAZWOPER spill. Here's how we define that at our facility. Now, what are we expecting our employees to do? And from there, that's going to determine what level of training that they need. So what physical actions do they need to take? So awareness level, operations, or technician. And we'll talk about what goes into each one of those components. But common mistakes you might hear is we don't respond, but the employees may use a spill kit as a part of this HAZWOPER spill response. That's considered response. They may not be the one that's actually cleaning it up, but they may need operations level training. So we'll talk about this a little more. So our basic core decision framework that we'll continue to use as we go through this is notify and evacuate. They're going to need awareness level HAZWOPER training. If they're containing the spill, there are defensive actions. So they're throwing out the boom, throwing out the absorbent, but they're not actually touching the spill. Operations. If they're stopping the release and they're taking that offensive action, it's going to be technician level. So this is the most practical way to assign these levels and the easiest way to think about it. And you'll be surprised at the hours that are actually included with each of these levels and what the hourly requirement actually is. And just telling you, spoiler alert, there's 40 hours not anywhere associated on this slide. And you'll be surprised to hear why. So let's talk about these HAZWOPER training levels and the requirements. Now, to clarify, of course, this is specific to subpart Q. Now, remember, that's specific to emergency response operations. We're not talking uncontrolled. We're not talking Superfund sites. So those uncontrolled hazards at a cleanup site. We're not talking TSDF. We're talking like at an industrial facility. So awareness level HAZWOPER. These are those employees who are just going to recognize hazards. They may be the one that starts the process, makes those emergency phone calls, and they may start to get everybody else out. Hey guys, there's been an event, let's evacuate. They're not using spill kits. They're not containing or controlling the release. They are not coming in contact at any point with that material. So these are people like office staff or operators who may not be involved in the response. Now, surprisingly enough, like I said, there's actually no set hours for the awareness level. It's what's called competency based. So it's one of those lovely things in the regulations where they essentially just leave it open for interpretation. And we'll talk about really what competency means here in a little bit and how you should document it. But that's how the verbiage is said within the regulation, is it's competency based. There's no actually set number of hours. Now we will see, like a industry standard where folks will say, 4 to 8 hours, or, take an 8-hour course, awareness level. But again, regulatory wise, there's not a specific set number of hours. There is the requirement though for the annual refreshers. So for any of these levels of HAZWOPER we'll talk about, there's always going to be that annual requirement, of course, to keep things fresh. But again, surprisingly, awareness level, no set hours, but they're never coming in contact with the spill. They're just making phone calls and getting out of Dodge. Now we move up a level here. Now we get into operations level. So this is where at your facility they'd be taking defensive response actions. So they're maybe containing the spill from a safe distance. They're throwing up the absorbent boom to prevent spread, or maybe they're going and blocking nearby drains to protect the environment. But what they're not doing, they're not approaching the source. They're not stopping the release. So they're not actually coming in contact with the material. So again, they're deploying absorbents, placing drain covers. In this case, there is a set number of hours, so minimum 8 hours, as well as showing competency. Annual refresher. So, again, we've still not gotten to where they need a 40-hour. which again, for most facilities, they just default right to the 40-hour, not really understanding these regulations. So again, these folks are not coming in contact with the spill, but they're just taking that defensive response. Then we bump it up to the third level here at your facility, a technician level. So this is the offensive response. So they approach the source, they stop the release. They may be either closing valves, plugging leaks, repairing equipment. In this case, there is a minimum specified within the regulation of 24 hours and also demonstrating competency. Again, we'll come back to that. And then the annual refresher, just like with all of the levels. So critical rule here, if they're touching the source and they're touching the material, they're going to need technician level. So they're going to need the 24-hour HAZWOPER. And this right here is typically what we see facilities get confused, and they think that they need the 40-hour. But again, we'll talk about when you may need the 40-hour, but that's a small percentage. Most of the time, if your people are going out and assisting with spill response, again, actually coming in contact with the material, putting out the absorbents, cleaning it up, generally 24 hours is going to be what's required. So with our common mistakes that we see, so maintenance shuts off a leaking valve. Maybe they're having to put on some special gear to go do that. They're coming in contact with that material. So there may be times where a facility say, oh, well, they're just operations. You know, it's just defensive. They're failing to realize that they have approached the source, they've stopped the release, and they may come in contact with that material. So they may need that 24-hour technician level. So this is why I said at the beginning, it's so important you clearly define what your employees' roles are in spill response, because you may find someone's been classified as operations, only being defensive. Come to find out, they're actually taking offensive actions, and they should be trained at the technician level. So we want to make sure we actually look at that at our sites and how that's actually going to work with our people. So typical setup we may see at a facility, so a layered response. So we've got our operators. All they do is say, oh, there's been a spill. This looks like this is not an incidental. This is an emergency situation. They're going to report it. They're going to need that awareness level training. And again, there's no set hours within the regulations, just that they're competent and that they've received some sort of training and it's documented, and they do have to have the awareness refresher every single year. Now we have our spill team who may come out and they start to contain it. They're not actually touching it. They're just containing it or protecting drains and waterways. They're taking defensive actions, operations. And then we have maintenance, or maybe, your higher hazmat spill team. They have just a higher level of training here. Now at the technician level, they're plugging, they're patching, they're stopping the leak, but they're potentially coming in contact with that material. Now they need technician level 24 hours. So this is the general framework we see at a normal industrial facility. But like we said, a lot of times gets overlooked and people jump straight into the 40-hour, which is actually overkill. Now, some facilities may choose an alternative strategy of just evacuate only. Nobody's doing, diddly squat. All they're doing is awareness level. They're going to evacuate and call the emergency services, whether that's the fire department, the hazmat team, your contractor. In that case, great, there is lower training burden because they're not doing anything defensive. They're doing nothing offensive. But of course, the problem is you have less internal control now, because now no one's doing anything until those first responders show up, which may be a best fit for your facility and your operations. Again, no one size is going to fit all. So we have to look at how our facility operates, what type of HAZ we have, what those spill situations look like, and then what our people are trained to do and what you really feel comfortable assigning them to do. So we want to include all of that in our considerations. So under the emergency response program, so under 40-hour, under HAZWOPER, which of this applies at our industrial facilities? So let's clarify that. So the key distinction here, like we said, are those different sections. So core distinction. Under Q, this is our emergency response regulations, kind of generalized for our industrial facilities, essentially, where known characterized hazards, we have a spill team program, versus under E, like with a Superfund site or, a turnover on the highway where they don't know what's spilled, it's unknown, it's uncontrolled. That's where we get pushed into 40-hour territory. So it's the nature and extent of the hazard that is the deciding factor. So at your facility, it's obvious, you're going to have some type of spill program. You're going to have a spill team. You know what's going to be spilled if anything spills versus unknown situations. So like a hazmat team that comes out, like your contractor, they should have a 40-hour because they don't really ever know what they're going to be facing because it may be different every day. So we want to have that in the back of our minds as well, because if you do have any potential at your site, depending on what you do, for an unknown or uncontrolled contamination, then yes, you may want to consider 40-hour training if you're expecting your people to respond in that offensive manner. So for situations that actually trigger a need for a 40-hour. Active on-site remediation. So like we said, some type of hazmat or hazardous waste remediation. Hazards are not fully characterized. There's a potential for hazardous exposures. Superfund sites, they'll definitely need a 40-hour. RCRA corrective actions. So these are sites where there's some type of hazardous materials contamination, very similar to on-site remediation, again, where there could be the potential for exposure to those uncontrolled hazards. Permitted TSD facility workers, those treatment, storage, and disposal facility workers, if they are actively working in areas of hazardous waste management and they're responsible for spill response, then they may need their 40-hour as well. Or, like we said, may apply at your facility if there could be uncharacterized emergency releases. So nature and extent of contamination is unknown, the volume potentially unknown, then you may need to trigger for the 40-hour. So that could be like pipelines going through the facility or, something where there could be a lot of material that's going to be spilled or released at one time. And if you're expecting your people to respond to that, where the nature and extent of contamination could be unknown, then yes, they may need a 40-hour. So who actually needs it? Kind of in a nutshell. Emergency response program. This would be under Q. Again, general industrial facilities, those 3 different levels we talked about: awareness, operations, and technician. Hazard is known. We've assessed our own facilities. The team is trained to respond, controlled, or those routine spill cleanups. Versus our 40-hour training requirement, again, triggered by unknown contamination, uncontrolled contamination. It is not for routine spill response. And again, this could be applied to your facility. It just depends on what you have going on there. But for a majority of our sites, we fall under Q. So many industrial employees never even need the 40-hour. But like we said, that's people don't understand the regulations and they just default straight to that. So this summarizes this in a nutshell of which level of training that your people might potentially need. So awareness level, entry level. Anyone who might discover or witness the release. So it could be security, very common one. Maintenance, general plant workers. They're only notifying and they're not taking any response actions. And again, within the HAZWOPER regulations, there's no hours specifically required for how long that training has to be. But it is competency based, and we're going to define that in just a minute. Then we have operations, your core spill team. So those are the folks that respond defensively. And there actually, surprisingly, is not hours specified for this either within the regulations. But typically we see 8 to 24 hours. And again, it goes back to being competency based, and to actually get them competent, they're probably going to need 8 to 24 hours of training. Requires also the awareness level competency, so the level before it. So again, these are the folks that are just throwing out boom, protecting the drains, but they're not touching the material. Then we have our technician level. These are our offensive, active interventionists. So they need both awareness and operations level of training and their technician training. So the regulations are very clear. This one is 24 hours. So how to use their PPE, chemical properties, containment, decon training, they would need that under the 24-hour. So note at the bottom, important point to remember, operations versus technician, direct substance contact. So if your team is going to be plugging, patching, physically stopping a release at the source, they're going to need the 24-hour. So we want to make sure that we've made this clear distinction at our facility within our program. And then we want to look at it from the audit perspective. So if we are, like we said, worst case scenario, we've had a situation, people got hurt, now people are, OSHA's asking questions. What do employees do during a spill? Have we clearly defined it by role? Who stops the release? Have we made that clear within the policy and the program? And then show me their training. always a good idea to document the training material, what they were trained on. I know when I do HAZWOPers, and a lot of other trainers do it, they'll actually share the HAZWOPer content. That way it helps in a minute when we talk about competency-based. It shows whoever may be looking at this material, this is what they were trained on. They are indeed competent. We had some hands-on practice. We showed competency. They have it all documented. But if we're seeing a mismatch between what is actually happening in the field versus what you have documented, just like everything else in health and safety, that's where we potentially see citation risk. So just to talk momentarily about the other two sections. Again, most of us, have some type of industrial facility or a facility where we're falling under, Part Q. These are E and P. So E is for cleanup sites, like we said, Superfund sites, remediation projects. Hazards are unknown, variable, and changing. They're out there disturbing contaminated media, so there's a lot higher potential for exposures. Versus TSDF operations, like we said, those treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, they have their own set of regulations under HAZWOPer because they're much more controlled. Hazards are more predictable, procedural. So just a little bit different perspectives under the HAZWOPer regulations. So cleanup, uncertainty, higher exposure potential. So these are like our hazmat teams, like your contractors that you call when the situation exceeds your personnel's ability to clean it up. They should have 40 hours. TSDFs, controlled operations with known hazards. And they've got some of their own levels of training as well. So just a quick breakdown. So these cleanup site workers, and you may see, and the reason we're kind of explaining this is you'll sometimes see people pull from this information and try to intermix it with your industrial training requirements, under Part Q. But again, they're not pulling from the right section here. So cleanup sites, Superfund sites, got to have the 40-hour if they're out there doing intrusive work. So they're excavating, they're drilling. There's a higher exposure potential. So there's 40 hours for those that are actually out there getting dirty. 24 hours for those who have limited exposure. So things like surveyors, inspectors. So they're much more non-intrusive, more controlled. Now they can upgrade if the scope of work increases, where now they will be getting dirty and in the dirt and the muck. They can also take additional course work for 16 hours of training plus additional field experience. But again, this is cleanup work, not typical facility spill response. And again, we see this get intermixed at our facilities, and it's not always correct. Now, those treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, like we said, they're under their own subpart. So initial training is 24 hours required. Annual refreshers, of course, focusing on their site-specific emergency procedures and hazards. If they respond to releases, they've got to have HAZWOPer response levels, just like under Q, like us at an industrial facility. If they don't have to respond to spills, then they have to follow some other TSDF-specific requirements for their emergency action plans. But again, we don't want to intermix what we see for facility response plans, like our industrial sites, our TSDFs, and then those uncontrolled cleanup sites. That's where the confusion comes in, is people are mixing those all together. Now, another requirement that sometimes gets thrown out there is the hands-on requirement question. So is there this 8-hour hands-on requirement for HAZWOPer? Because, usually like the 5th day of a 40-hour, it'll be hands-on, or the 3rd day of a 24-hour. There's actually no specific requirement for fixed number of hands-on hours. However, it all comes back to, is the training effective and is it competency-based? So that means if they have to do it in real life, we want to make sure they actually do it in the training. Using their gear, their PPE, deploying the spill kits or the equipment, monitoring. Do they know how to use their monitors? We want to do some type of mock drill, mock run-through of what they will actually be doing to make sure they're truly competent before we give them certificates. So there may not be this requirement that says you must do 8 hours, but the point is OSHA does say it has to be effective and it has to be competency-based, and so we want to be confident in our documentation and the training that our people are actually receiving. So where hands-on is expected, pull out the PPE, the donning, the doffing, talking about the limitations with that gear, when they may need to step back and call the hazmat team and say, this exceeds my 24-hour training. Using absorbents, deploying boom, how to use drain covers, if they do have gas meters like PIDs, all of that would need to be something we incorporate as part of the competency-based requirement. Of course, there are HAZWOPER courses where you can do them solely online, but it could make it challenging if you did have a serious incident occur, someone was seriously injured or killed, and then OSHA comes back and is asking, all right, let me see your HAZWOPER program. How was this training conducted? How did you verify they were competent? And if all you did was take, a 40-hour course online, and then you were like, all right, good enough, and then now you're in this situation where someone got seriously hurt, that could potentially be, you're getting into citation territory, and you're basically going to have to rework your program and your training, because we don't want the first time that they ever put this gear on, look at their spill kits, pull out the monitors, to be when it's a real emergency. Should be during practice. Now, something else that sometimes gets mixed in here is we want to make sure we understand what is the actual field experience requirement component of this. And it is important to note this is specific to cleanup sites. So you may have heard this mixed in with, general industrial sites. 40-hour workers need 24 hours of supervised field experience, real work under supervision. 24-hour workers need 8 hours of supervised experience. But this requirement is specific to cleanup sites. So again, don't get confused and mix it in with what you have going on at your industrial facility, because it is under a different part of HAZWOPER. So let's talk about a few more, going in kind of our last section here, because I know about 416 here, but common mistakes in practical application. So first off, let's talk a little bit about competency. What does it actually mean? We'll look at a few of the common mistakes that facilities make when applying HAZWOPER requirements, and some scenario-based applications and kind of some key lessons, hopefully some takeaways that you'll be able to go and apply at your facility and kind of reassess your HAZWOPER program. So we keep saying this, we've said it throughout the presentation, competency. So, of course, big difference between competency versus completion. So anybody can check a box. Like we said, sit down, do a 40-hour online. If you've ever taken one of those, it's brutal. Not a good time. But again, that's just a box checker. All we've done is complete it. Versus competency showing, yes, we can perform the work safely. So red flags for this would be, we start asking employees based upon their level of HAZWOPER training and based off of what you have in your program or policy, the expectation of them. And then you ask them, what would you do during a spill event? And if they can't explain their role, their limits, and where they fall in this process, that's going to raise a red flag for competency. Or they're performing actions that are outside their training level. So they've only been trained at the defensive perspective, the operations role, but they're actually taking the offensive role, the technician level. That's going to be a red flag that your people are undertrained. So the certificate's not going to prove compliance, but behavior does. And so we want to make sure we don't have a false sense of security here. So, talking about some mistakes. Mistake number 1, everybody needs the 40-hour. I think, we've clarified now that simply is not the case. Misunderstanding of cleanup site requirements gets mixed in with our general, requirements at an industrial facility. So 40-hour is specific to cleanup site workers and those intrusive high exposure tasks, which again could be a reality at your site if you've got the potential for uncontrolled releases of unknown materials, or these potentials for an IDLH environment. Maybe, yes, you may need the 40-hour if you're expecting your people to respond in that manner. But if you're not expecting them to respond that way, they're never going to put on level A or B gear. They're never going to be out there if there was an IDLH situation. Then why are we training them to that level? All we're doing is reducing relevance, making employees think they're allowed to do more than they should, or you're overwhelming them and stressing them out to where they're like, oh my God, I couldn't do that. Like, I can't, oh, no way. Well, now they're not learning anything. So again, we want to make sure we rein this in that we're actually hitting who needs to be hit with the level of training they're actually required to do during a spill. Mistake number 2, not really defining what types of spills happen at your site. So what is an emergency at your facility? So we see a lack of clear classification process, conservative interpretation. There's no clear boundaries and definitions. And many spills are incidental. They may not be an emergency that requires a HAZWOPER trained response. So that's why we want to clearly define in our policies and procedures. Looking at hazards at your site? What's the potential environments it would be released into? And what are your employees' capabilities? And what type of gear would they be wearing? Again, we want to make sure we've clearly defined non-emergency versus emergency, not overcomplicate the program or misalign our response planning as a result. Mistake number 3. Again, we think operations is the 24-hour. So we hear this all the time. People think they hear the word operations and they're getting confused with those cleanup sites and the industrial site, emergency response training. They're not the same thing. They may still use the word operations, but it's different contexts here. So operations level, like at your industrial facility, emergency response training, minimum 8 hours, plus we demonstrate they have the competency to do their job. Again, we don't want to assume that they all need 24-hour, 40-hour, again, incorrect training assignments, misunderstanding of roles, overconfidence or underconfidence, or they're just not learning anything at all. Mistake number 4. Now, again, we did say there is no written requirement for hands-on training, but OSHA does expect there to be some practical level to your training. They need to be able to demonstrate their ability to do their assigned duties and role. So if we're seeing poor response performance, that's going to lead to increased risk during incidents. Again, it's not going to do anyone any favors sitting on the computer and clickety-clicking through a presentation and never actually putting their hands on this stuff and seeing it firsthand. And then mistake number 5, more training means it's safer. Of course, training needs to match the role, it needs to match the responsibility. And like we said, there's going to be confusion. There's going to be either too much confidence or not enough confidence in what they're doing. And that's why we want to make sure we clearly define these roles. We don't just want to be like, well, I'm unsure, so everybody's getting the 40-hour. Again, I see it all the time. I'll see people sitting in that course wondering why the heck that they're even there to begin with, because they will never be involved in any of this. So what's the point of that? Really, what is the point? There isn't one. We want them to take away their actual understanding of what they will actually be doing. Mistake number 6, misinterpreting. We don't respond, but they actually do. So the policy may say they're only going to evacuate, but in reality, they're grabbing spill kits. So HAZWOPER is going to apply whether it is intended or not. Again, what's written in the policy may not be reality. So we want to make sure we have these conversations with our team, not only during training, but also incorporating it into some type of toolbox talk that you do regularly or whatever it may be, making sure people truly understand what their role is and what their actual behavior will be during a spill response. So our decision framework, wrapping it up here. Is it incidental or is it an emergency? We've got to make that determination up front. Have that within your program and your policies. Make sure your employees understand that in the context of your facility. 2, are employees responding? If the answer to that is yes, then we need to ask, all right, well, what actions are we asking them to actually take? And from there, that's going to determine whether they need awareness, operations, or technician. So, again, action tools. Notify, awareness level. Contain, operations. And stop is our technician level. And like we said in a nutshell, awareness level, there really is no set level of hours based off of competency. Same for operations, but typically we see industry standard 8 to 24 hours. And then technician level, there is a specific requirement, 24 hours for that training. So to give you an example here, I promise we are wrapping it up. We have a 30-gallon solvent spill. Now we've got vapors and it's near a storm drain. Again, depending on what, constitutes an emergency at your facility, I think in most cases this would, especially if we've got vapors present. Now we've got people donning PPE like respirators. Now we've got a potential environmental impact. That's looking like HAZWOPER territory. That's looking like an emergency. So we look at, yep, it's an emergency. Now we look at what training level by role are we expecting from our people. So our workers nearby may just have that awareness level. They start making the phone calls. The spill team, they may go out and start blocking drains to hopefully prevent it from getting to the waterway. And then your maintenance team, or maybe some other component of your team that is actually going to go out, upright the drum and start cleaning it up, they would need the technician level. 24-hour, they're coming in contact with that material. But again, like we said, spill kits. If we have spill kits around the facility and we're expecting our employees to use them and it may be used in a situation that is beyond incidental, that's when we need to look at, we may need folks who are operations level trained, not just awareness level. And again, even if you only have oil at your facility, if you've got a lot of that material, there's a potential for a non-incidental, a true emergency spill. And so do you have the right training with your people? And do they know how to respond? And then last scenario, a drain risk. So again, may not be a massive spill, but once it starts getting into a waterway, now we've got this environmental impact. Now it may be classified as an emergency. We're having to call out spill contractors. This may now bounce us into HAZWOPER territory. It's no longer incidental. And then last one, operations creep. So the team starts defensively. All they're doing is blocking the drains, or all they're doing is throwing out some boom. Now they start to move towards the source. They're getting a little brave, a little big for their britches. Now their role changes mid-response. Now they're starting to clean it up. Now they're touching it, coming in contact with it. Again, we want to make sure that they understand what their role is, because if they move into this, operations creep, they may need a higher level of training. So don't forget your contractors, though. It's part of your vetting process, or it should be for your spill response contractors. Are they trained? They should have a 40-hour, because they do fall under those uncontrolled, unpredictable spill events. So they should have a 40-hour with the refresher. So you want to ask them that and confirm. And you want to be careful with some of the larger spill response companies. And I'm not picking on anyone, but like US Ecology, Clean Harbors, etc., because a lot of times they do use subcontractors. And so that's part of the conversation you want to have with them, is to make sure, do you have those conversations with the subcontractors before you send them to our site? Like, are they all trained? Do they have their 40 hours? Is it documented? So we want to include that as part of our programs, our policies, and our thoughts. So wrapping it up here, roles. Clearly define your roles. Should be written within your programs and train to those roles. Again, don't, overkill here. We want to truly equip your team with what they need to succeed. And then clearly document those decisions. How did you determine what role needed operations versus technician? Or if your facility truly does need the 40-hour training, if it is something that could be uncontrolled, IDLH environments. And then be flexible, reevaluate. Operations may change, new materials may be brought in, and that may mean your people need a different level of training. So look at your roles, train to those roles, document your decisions, and reevaluate when needed. So that's what HAZWOPER is all about here. Role-based, risk-based, and then the actions of your employees or your personnel. So if you can clearly define what each employee does during a release, then you can defend your entire HAZWOPER program.
Is it too late, though? Because we could always have it tomorrow.
So hopefully that was helpful for you guys in determining kind of at your site what level of HAZWOPER your people need. So again, I'm going to share this presentation after anyways, if you can't access these QR codes, if you are on your phone. But hopefully it was helpful in terms of being able to reference and determine and kind of look at your own site and where your people are at. So I'm going to open up the chat here. I see you got a lot of things popping in. See what we've got here.
Yeah. I was following along as well. And so one comment, just I'll throw in, Abby, just because I was in healthcare and hospital setting as well as, clinic setting.
Yeah,
I can remember after having left the chemical plant, right, and going to the hospital and the ER department, they were really contaminated patients.
I don't want to have tacos again. I was going to make pad thai with that.
It sounds like there's a couple people talking. I can't quite hear.
I can make pad thai. You want me to make pad thai?
Shh. Somebody's talking about dinner.
I want pad thai.
I do too. Anyway, in a healthcare setting, it was really great back in the day, when all of a sudden OSHA came out with this guide to first receivers guide to contaminated patients, not first responders. And so that is a really wonderful document that helps clarify a bunch of this stuff.
Yeah.
And yet when I went to work at I was in the education department at the hospital, they didn't know how to put on a PAPR. They didn't know how to suit up. They didn't know how to use the PPE properly. So that was where a lot of that came into play. And then the other quick comment was when you talked about the contractors, boy, is that can be a snake that can bite you.
Yeah.
Right. So, but thank you very much, because that was very, I like the way that you used your decision process.
Yeah.
And we'll maybe talk more for the potential client we were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone have any questions that they want to hop off of mute? I was looking at what you guys had put in the chat. Yeah, all good comments in here, it looks like.
Yeah, feel free to come off, unmute yourself, I should say.
Well, I will show you guys, just to wrap it up, I do have, this is basically what the QR code will take you to, and I'll send this to your leadership team here after the call, the link, if you weren't able to use the QR code. But we've got the whole presentation in here. It is in PDF format, so you can go back and reference stuff. There's also, of course, like the OSHA guidance document on all of this that really gets in the nitty gritty. And then this was just a helpful document through the Georgia Environmental Compliance Assistance Program that also helps break down these different levels of training. So a couple helpful tidbits. And then the other link I'll send to is just all of these different presentations I've given, various different events. So maybe there's something else in there you might find helpful.
How are you sending those, to our email, or are you going to include them here in the chat for us to download?
I can do in the chat too. Yeah, I can do that right now.